Okay, so there are 4 principles of biology that we're going to review in these video lectures for the um, lectures on our fundamentals of biology. And they are evolution, origins of life, taxonomy, and the essential building blocks of life for the macromolecules. So today we're going to just do evolution and evolution as a bioethics topic. So there's a lot of things surrounding evolution that we can talk about, and we can choose that possibly as one of our uh, more specific topics that we'll go over. But an understanding of evolution is very important for understanding current theories in biology. It's even been said that nothing in biology makes sense unless you have an understanding of evolution. And that's a paraphrase of a famous quote, which I don't have here. But anyway, that's the idea. So we are going to review this because of its importance in understanding the science of biology. Evolution, as you all know, was first proposed by Charles Darwin, but he had a co-discoverer or co-theorist whose name was Alfred Wallace. But Darwin gets most of the credit because he did more than just come up with the idea. He developed it, wrote a whole book. It was his life work. Um, and the idea, or main part of it, is descent with modification. So descent meaning progeny, generations. If you want to think in human terms, having children, generations of children over time, and over time they are modified. They are different than their parent population. So he formulated this theory based on a bunch of evidence that he gathered over many years. He was actually very meticulous in his writing and in his collection of data. Um, and not only in science, but also in other, he was also influenced by other things such as economics. So some of the evidence that he compiled. One, he was a naturalist aboard a ship called the HMS Beagle, which traveled around the world. And he was the guy who just, looked at nature, observed birds and whales. And when they would go in port, he would collect specimens and he would preserve those specimens and take them with him back to um, England when he was done with the voyage. Well, he went to the Galapagos Islands, which is a very unique place, has a very unique flora and fauna, and he noticed that. And one of the things he also noticed is the diversity of finches there. He actually didn't put together that where the finches came from and the different, specifically where they were. That was actually discovered later as more people went back and looked at it further. But he was still influenced by the diversity of the Galapagos Islands and the diversity of the animal life that he saw throughout his expeditions. All right, one of the non-scientific, well, non-natural science influence over his theory was done by an economist named Malthus, who wrote an essay on the principle of population. And the basic thing that he noticed was that there are lots of people who are born, but not all of them survive. And what is it that determines whether people live or die? And there must be some criteria, something that allows others to live and some not to live. Okay, and this is a basic tenet of evolution, is that you have variety in your populations and that some of them are better fit for their environment than others. A geologist named Lyell, he read some of his works, and one of the books that he wrote was called Principles of Geology, which came up with this kind of new theory about the geology of the Earth, in that it took, according to Lyell's theory, millions and millions of years to account for the different strata, the different layers in the rocks that you see in geological formations around the world. And this was a new theory. Before that, people just thought, oh, well, everything's 6,000 years old. But now there's this thought that, oh, things are actually millions of years old. And that changes when you're thinking about changes and gradual changes and the formation of species, millions of years allows that to happen, where 6,000 years doesn't. Darwin was also a pigeon breeder, believe it or not. So you can take pigeons. In the wild, most pigeons look pretty drab, pretty much the same. They're all kind of just these little gray squatty pigeons. But you can actually artificially select for different traits and breed all these different varieties of pigeons. So that's what that picture there is. The same thing has happened with dogs. Dogs are all ancestors of wolves that were domesticated and then artificially selected for different traits. And that's how we can get a Chihuahua from a wolf ancestor, by selecting for smaller and smaller and more annoying traits until you get a Chihuahua. Well, if you can do this artificially, there must be a mechanism for it to naturally occur, and then we just mimic that as humans as we understand it. So that's more evidence, which Darwin saw and gave as evidence towards his theory. So his evidence wasn't complete. There's been a lot of things which have added to the theory since, but with those basic tenets and a lot of examples, he wrote on the origin of species by means of natural selection and published it. Again, based on this idea of descent with modification, or that an environment, the natural environment, creates conditions which select for certain traits in populations. And those that are more matched to their environment survive, and those that are less matched do not survive. It received a lot of criticism because it did not have a method of inheritance. So we didn't know about genes at this time, and that was a criticism. The fossil record was also very incomplete. And so we had fossils, but you couldn't clearly see that, this species was related to this other species, because the fossils we found were so different from each other. And then the age of the Earth at that time was thought to be thousands of years old, not millions of years old. Since, however, we have accumulated a lot of information which kind of dispels those first original qualms against it. One, we discovered genetics. We discovered a mode of inheritance, and Gregor Mendel is the father of genetics. He was able to show that traits are inherited and how they're inherited, and called it discrete factors, which were later called genes. The fossil record, when we look now, we found a lot more fossils, and we're better at finding fossils, and we continue to find fossils which show a more and more complete story of evolution which has occurred over millions of years. Some great examples of this are horse evolution. So we found a lot of these fossils which are intermediates between what we think are the most ancient ancestors of horses to what we have today. And that's what that figure down there is showing. And then also molecular evidence. So we can look at DNA, RNA, proteins of different organisms, and we see their relationships. Well, that points to them probably having a common ancestor, and then diverging from that common ancestor through evolution, when different populations go to different or are separated into different environments. So those things have continued to give stronger and stronger evidence for this theory of evolution. We also have comparative anatomy. So when you look at the bones in different animals, here we have different mammals at the bottom here, you'll find that they have pretty much the same bones. They've all just been modified for different functions. Well, that points to, again, a common ancestor, and then a divergence of those traits as populations match to their environment. An analogous trait is something, excuse me, something that has the same function but is a different structure. What we see below here are homologous traits. So these are all the same structures with different functions. But both analogous and homologous traits show that our environment is shaping traits in different ways. And lastly, more and more evidence shows that the Earth is not thousands of years old, but in fact billions of years old. Okay, my baby's waking up. So sorry about that. And this is enough for evolution to take place, enough time. All right, so back to Darwin and some of the things we've talked about, the scientific method. Well, how did Charles Darwin use this in his theory? Well, he gathered evidence and he put forth a theory, and then he put that theory into, test, not by direct manipulation, not by a controlled laboratory experiment, but by compiling more and more evidence throughout the world and fitting those facts together to form his theory. And he used both, inductive and deductive reasoning, both, things that had been established and understood to kind of postulate this theory, deduce based on these things, and also based on things that are already known, kind of going back and applying those principles to individual instances. And we just talked about, these are great discussion questions, great exam questions, and great questions for you to go back to your notes and kind of review and look at, what evidence did he compile, what evidence was compiled later, and then why is it considered a sound theory. Okay, so what is evolution? Evolution is currently defined as a change in traits in a population over time. Change in traits over time from one population to another. You need three things in order for that to happen. One, you need variation in the trait. So some traits can be evolving and others maybe not. If every individual in the population has the same trait, then there's no way that it can evolve. You need selection. We talked about artificial selection is one way we can artificially show evolution occurring in populations. But selection can also occur naturally matching to the environment through sexual selection or just a random separation of a population which creates different traits. And you need a mode of inheritance, which is DNA. And that's constant. We know that traits are passed from one generation through processes of DNA replication and DNA exchange, sexual reproduction, and fertilization. All right, so let's say we have a population of fish that are 50-50, 50% red, 50% blue. And a shark comes into the area and there's some change in the water to make some of them more visible to the other. After the sharks reproduce and the fish reproduce, we have a change in the traits to where now 75% of them are blue and 25% of them are red. The composition of traits, the variation of traits has now changed. And so we would say this population has evolved based on some sort of change in the environment, which is, a change in the diffraction of the water based on maybe a change in the salt concentration, which allows sharks to see the red ones more visibly than the blue ones. Okay, and we've demonstrated then evolution occurring here.